Hello everybody and welcome to our first Corona lesson. In today's short introduction to the poetry unit, we're going to talk a little bit about the basics of types of verse, sound devices, and figurative language. But in addition to that, I think that a lot of us consider poetry to be something that is alien or outside of our everyday experience, while in reality, it's a big part of our everyday lives. I doubt that any of us sit around reading books of poetry, contemplating the complexities of life and how life can be beautiful and painful at the same time. But I do think that poetry is an integral part of our lives. The first is nursery rhymes, which of course we're introduced to at a very young age, slogans that we're bombarded by every day through advertising, music lyrics that I'm sure that most of us are pretty interested in terms of the musicians that we enjoy. And finally, cliches, which are just things that we say all the time that have poetic elements within them. And so let's begin with nursery rhymes. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. The question I'd like us to consider is, what makes that sound good? Why can you tell this to a 3-year-old who can't analyze it or think about it on a deeper level? Why does that make a 3-year-old giggle? And so the first reason is rhyme. But the rhyme can't be completely random. This follows a pretty typical rhyme scheme for what's called a quatrain, which is a stanza with 4 lines, and it goes A, B, B. That's because we always start off with A, if you're unfamiliar with this, and we will work on this later on in the unit, but star automatically is labeled A. If the next line rhymes with it, then we stick with A, and we only look at the end rhyme, the last sound or sounds of each line. And then when we go on to high, of course, it doesn't rhyme with star and R, so now we would move on to B. And that's why high and sky are both labeled B. If we went on to another line and that line had the word car in it at the end, then it would go back to A. And so that's part of what makes it sound good, but that's not the only thing. Notice that all of these lines, all 4 of them in this stanza, are relatively the same length. And if we were to count the syllables per line, we would also find a pattern. And so it really all comes down to math. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, that's 7 syllables. And then lines 2 and 4 are 6 syllables. And so this is what makes it sound good. And it all comes down to the math and to the patterns. Next, let's look at slogans. You're probably unfamiliar with this one because it's from years ago, but I have chosen it because it's a simile. Chevy like a rock. Although a truck hopefully is practically nothing like a rock, they use it to illustrate its strength and durability. You probably have never even opened a phone book, but the yellow pages are a section of the phone book that would concentrate on businesses. And so the old slogan that they use for this is, yellow pages, let your fingers do the walking. Of course, fingers can't actually walk, aside from kind of making them go along the table or something like that. But this is personification. And so advertisers use these slogans because they help to make things more memorable. The last one, which I think is still around for Bounty paper towels, the quicker picker-upper. And here, not only do we have rhyme with quick and pick, but we also have a bit of alliteration with the repetition of the P sound. And that can be something else that makes it memorable. Moving on to music lyrics. And I choose Bob Dylan because he's generally regarded as the best appreciated lyricist in at least American music. And I know a lot of you probably don't listen to him or know much of his stuff or anything, but because he was one of the first to really write about the time period and the social struggles within the United States, I choose him. And let's just look at a couple of stanzas of The Times Are Changing.
Gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are changing.
I'm sure you're all aware that often music lyrics will have poetic techniques, and hopefully later on in the unit we'll do an activity where you all choose a song that you know and like and do a little project identifying the different poetic techniques that are part of it. Here, if we take a look first at the italicized section here, the waters around you have grown. Clearly this isn't literal. It's not about somebody who's literally drowning in water, but that the times are changing. And so the waters growing helps to create an image associated with that change. And that is a metaphor. Same thing with you'll be drenched to the bone. That metaphor is extended. And drenched to the bone is actually a cliche, and that's not literal either. You can't literally be drenched to your bones, but we all understand what it means. Then in this section, we have saving, swimming, changing. So we have a little bit of end rhyme there. But in addition to that, we have other sound techniques like alliteration with start, swimming, sink, stone. And we have in italics there yet another simile, sink like a stone. And again, that provides an image for us to picture a stone sinking to the bottom of a body of water and how that could happen to people who refuse to change. And so music lyrics certainly very poetic. And the last one, cliches. Generally, cliches are something that we try to avoid in our writing, meaning that a cliche is some kind of phrase that was really clever the first time somebody said it, but it's become cliche because it's been overused over time. And so if you say something's not my cup of tea, even if you don't drink tea, it just means it's something that you don't really like, that is not, doesn't fit your taste. I think we all know what it means is we say we're all in the same boat. We're all in the same situation, even though we're not in an actual boat. Or to break the ice because things are very awkward, and breaking the ice would help to loosen things up a little bit. Saying something like, I'm just going along for the ride is a cliche, meaning that I'm not all that interested in it, but I'm just kind of following everybody else to not create any problems. And so again, we typically want to avoid these in our writing unless we were drawing some attention to it, but we use these all the time, and most of them are pretty figurative and poetic. Normally you would get a packet on poetry and we'd fill in some notes, so all you need to do is watch here. But poetry versus prose means verse, I think we all know what verse is, and poetry, versus prose, which just means paragraph form. Everything that we've read so far this year has been prosaic, has been prose, like To Kill a Mockingbird as a novel, or Animal Farm as a novel, the short stories that we read, and pretty much everything that we've written as well, including the narrative essays, the persuasive essays, the research paper. All of those have been prosaic. However, how is poetry different from it? Usually poetry is going to be shorter. That's not always the case. Epic poems can be hundreds of pages long, but generally we know that poems are pretty short. The visual impression is very different. Instead of paragraphs, we have irregular lines often divided into stanzas. And so we want to make sure you use the right language when we're talking about poetry and not say the first section or the first paragraph, but rather the first stanza. Then when it comes to the language in poetry, this is probably the biggest difference, is that it's really concentrated and intense. And that because things don't have to follow typical sentence structures, there are going to be a lot of these sound devices that are purposeful, including rhythm, rhyme, alliteration, onomatopoeia, and so on. Also, this concentrated language will have a lot of figurative language within it, which is just language that isn't literal, such as similes, metaphors, personification, and so on. And what we're going to be doing is focusing for the first week just on sound devices, and then the second week just on figurative language devices. The final element is that the meaning that comes from a poem often depends on the immediate effect right then. Surprise, they challenge the reader to kind of take a closer look. So it usually doesn't spell things out perfectly. You have to do a little bit of work as a reader in order to understand the meaning behind it. And so a definition here: poetry is a compressed form of literature that is composed of carefully chosen words expressing great depth of meaning. It uses specific devices such as connotation, sound, and rhythm to express the appropriate combination of meaning and emotion. That's a very formal definition that kind of ruins the beauty of poetry, but it helps to get across what poetry generally is. And so the first list of terms that we need to know, and you can practice these by playing the Battleship game, which is just to the right of the video that you're watching, on the main poetry page on our website. And I've got some other questions in there as well to help to introduce the unit, but I'm going to go through the definitions here. You can listen to this if you want, or you can just dive right into the Battleship game. If you don't know how to play Battleship, ask your parents or look it up. The first is closed form. Closed form just means that the poem has to follow some rules. And so in the beginning of this presentation, when we looked at that nursery rhyme, that was written in closed form because it had a rhyme scheme. It had a pattern of syllables per line to make it sound good. The opposite of closed form is going to be free verse. Free verse means there are no rules, and it doesn't have to be any rhythm or rhyme or anything like that. The one at the bottom here, blank verse, is by far the hardest of the definitions on this page. And when we read Romeo and Juliet, it's written in blank verse. It's just a funny name, calling it blank, but it basically means that it's not rhymed for the most part, but it follows this rhythm called iambic pentameter, which means that there are 10 syllables per line, and it goes unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed in terms of the syllables throughout. We'll get to all this later. But regardless, that's what blank verse is. That's by far the hardest definition on this page. I think we all know what lines are. I only put that there because we want to make sure that we're not calling them sentences. They're lines. And when you go on to a new line, that's called a line break. Sometimes it will have punctuation. Sometimes it will not. If it does not, then you just continue reading straight through without pausing when going from one line to the next. A series of lines in a group is called a stanza. And a poem that has rhythm is one that has some kind of a pattern of syllables per line. Again, like when we looked at Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And so a poem that is written in closed form or that is in blank verse will have a rhythm to it, but free verse usually won't have any kind of definable rhythm to it. There is also rhymed verse, which just means that the poem rhymes, that there's a lot of end rhyme to it, that there's a rhyme scheme that you can identify in it. And then the last two terms are narrative versus lyric poetry. Narrative poetry, like the narrative essays that you wrote, tells a story. And so this would be like a ballad or an epic poem that actually tells a story, whereas most poems are lyrical. And a lyric poem focuses just on some kind of human emotion, some kind of topic, a scene, but it doesn't tell a story. It doesn't have characters or plot development or anything like that. And so again, if you go to our website and go to the main poetry page, the Battleship game is right here. And so play that, and that'll be it for today. Tomorrow, we're going to look at sound techniques in poetry and introduce that. And thank you for listening. Have a good day.